Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on reimagining your LHCC. We are really excited to be here today. I am Danielle Stevens. I am the Housing and Homeless System Sustainability Coordinator for the Weber Prosperity Center of Excellence. I work under the Weber County Commission and help facilitate the Weber Morgan LHCC. Jess, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Lucero. I'm an associate professor of social work at Utah State University. I also am the PIT count lead for the Bear River LHCC. Have been really active with our LHCC the last few years, and most recently led our community strategic plan.
Awesome. So today we're going to discuss various things related to needs and assets in community, community engagement principles and the case for community engagement, and strategies that LHCCs can use while considering assets and community engagement in their planning processes. There are typically two approaches to community development work. And this is the kind of work that we're doing. Even in the homeless system, we are working to develop our communities and improve the lives and situations of people that reside in them. And the two approaches to addressing community challenges are a needs approach and a capacity approach. And a needs approach is by far the most common approach utilized in community development. This approach is very focused on deficiencies that exist in communities and heavily emphasizes the need for human services programs and expansion of those programs to solve those problems. On the other hand, there is a capacity-based approach. And instead of first focusing on everything that is wrong in communities and everything that communities don't have, a capacity approach instead hones in on the capacity, skills, and assets that already exist in communities and uses that resource foundation to really understand where those resources can plug in community systems. And from there emerges policy designed to implement change in the community and solve problems. And in the work we do in homelessness, it's incredibly difficult. And we all know that there's never enough. There's never enough funding, never enough manpower, never enough partnerships or collaboration. And it's easy in our work, we typically take a needs-based approach. We focus very heavily on everything that's wrong in our communities, everything that we don't have. And it's easy to become siloed in that thinking and focusing only on those negative aspects in our community. But if we can flip our script a bit and approach our work from a different angle and instead focus on capacity that already exists, focus on our assets and how we can utilize those and how we can use those assets to inform how we should move forward and what our actual needs are in the community, we are more likely to emerge with a holistic understanding of community needs, causes of homelessness and issues associated with it, and we're more likely to have sustainable change in the long run.
Thanks, Danielle. So I want to just talk a little bit about what types of assets exist in a community. I first want to point you to, I should have put this on the screen, but if anybody's taking notes right now, Kretzmann and McKnight is the main sort of authors that I'm referring to here with ABCD principles. And you might be interested in checking out the ABCD Institute out of Chicago. You also might take a look at the Kansas's Community Toolbox. They have other really great community development resources and toolkits and sort of planning tools that are very much grounded in this perspective of asset based. Okay, so according to Kretzmann and McKnight, there are two sort of areas of assets that exist in our communities, and one is under the umbrella of actors and the other is under the umbrella of context. So when we're talking about actors, we're talking about the local people, the skills and talents of the local people who reside in the community that you're working in. And in the area of homelessness, right, those people can wear any number of hats. But of course, it would be important to highlight the lived experience of folks who have been homeless themselves. Associations are another type of actor asset. And so these are sort of networks of relationships in a community. Institutions are a little bit more formal than an association. These are agencies and professional types of entities. Physical assets, economic assets, and cultural assets all comprise this larger umbrella of the context. And one thing that I want to highlight here under these kind of contextual assets is the cultural assets. I think that's incredibly important when we're talking about the planning process, and sort of an asset or strengths-based approach to planning in a community, is recognizing how the ways that we know and the ways that we are and exist in the world in our own communities can be leveraged as part of the change process or the planned change process. So I'll share an example here in the Bear River area. Our homeless service system is missing some key components for a fully functioning homeless service system. But one thing, a cultural sort of asset that we're able to leverage here in the Bear River region is the sense of scrappiness, right? It's a sense of we're not quite rural, but not quite metropolitan. And, you know, I'd say there's certainly the sense, this cultural sense here in the Bear River region of figuring things out and getting a little bit of scrappy and creative to come up with some solutions. And that's an asset that in the planning process should be named and recognized and, like I said earlier, brought into the conversation to leverage through the process.
And I can provide an example for Weber Morgan about one of our assets too, that actually touches multiple systems in our community. We have an affordable housing panel that exists within our Weber Area Council of Governments. And on that panel sit mayors, various stakeholders in affordable housing like developers, transit from UTA, and advocacy groups and policymakers. And there is continually increasing acknowledgement that there is a severe affordable housing crisis in our community. And that crisis exists across the state, but the fact that we are now able to start leveraging those policymakers and their knowledge and influence in the community and start having more robust conversations around affordable housing and how that impacts homelessness in the community is an extreme asset for the Weber Morgan area.
Yeah, Danielle, I wanted to mention too, when we're talking about asset-based kind of community development or planning, one thing, Kretzmann and McKnight talk about these types of assets into additional kind of meta categories of primary and secondary types of assets. And when we're thinking about primary assets, those are things that are within the control of the local community, and secondary assets being things that are an asset to the community, but maybe not within the control of the local community. And so we're going to get a little bit more into community engaged types of strategies that you can use in the planning process. But I want to just put a plug in for an exercise, for a community exercise for asset mapping. It's a really, really useful strategy for when you're pulling stakeholders together to do what Danielle's talking about earlier about like shifting the mindset from a needs approach to an asset approach. Is this exercise of kind of going through these types of assets and trying to identify them in your community and really connecting them to the issue at hand, which in this case is homelessness.
And by doing that, you may discover assets that you never thought could plug into the homeless system, but in some way, they're able to, and they're able to fill a gap.
Okay, so I am a community engagement enthusiast. This is the type of work that I do at Utah State University. This is the type of research that I do. I very strongly believe that the answer to so many of our challenges in society can be found in community. And so I want to just, make a case for community engagement in the planning process. So many of us, and I wish I could see a raise of hands of who's here on the call. I suspect just because you're here in this session that you're interested in strategic planning and community engagement, but I don't know to what degree you've been involved in the planning process in your local communities, or maybe what geographic region you're representing. Some of you probably have quite a bit of experience, and maybe others are from communities where you're just starting to think about your own strategic plan. The thing that I will say, and this is not news to anybody, is that oftentimes these plans are written and developed sometimes under a mandate, sometimes because it's a good idea, but often the result of plans is that they sit on a shelf. And in this, era, it's an electronic shelf, which means sometimes it's hard to even locate on the internet. But they exist and as a guiding document, but often just collect dust. Okay. The strategic plans are really going to be the most successful when there is stakeholder input in the whole process, when it's a well-known plan by both internal and external publics, and when it's a document that actually guides the system decision-making. And, that sort of after the plan's written stage, when you're moving into an implementation plan, if you don't have really broad support for the plan, it's going to fall into that category that I mentioned at the top here of just kind of sitting on an electronic shelf. The real key from a community engagement perspective is including community engaged strategies in every step of the way throughout the strategic planning process.
So what is community engagement and why do we care? Community engagement is a process. It's a process with no clear beginning and definitely no endpoint. It's continual in the work that we do. And our systems, our societal systems, they intersect in many ways. And the homeless system, the work that we do, intersects with education, housing, healthcare, workforce development, etc. We're not isolated. We're not an island working to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. And through community engagement, we can bring people together who form a community, whether it's based on geographic proximity, special interest groups, or people in similar situations. We can bring all those people together so we can have a robust body that can address issues in the community and impact change on the well-being of community residents. And an engaged community with robust partnerships and coalitions can really be the vehicle for mobilizing people and resources and actually impacting the system, and can really be the catalyst for change in your community, for sustainable change that impacts policy, programs, and practices. And again, this is a process. It's a strategic process that we should always be engaging in, no matter where we are in our strategic planning process. And the specific purpose of this is to bring people together and figure out how to work together and where to plug people in as we work towards making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring.
Yeah, Danielle, I want to connect what you're saying with one of our previous slides around what asset-based community development looks like, or that kind of asset approach. Part of when you meld these two perspectives together, an asset-based approach and a community engaged kind of framework, that means that we're engaging these diverse stakeholders in the community and really thinking about what assets and strengths they bring to the table. And like Danielle mentioned earlier, sometimes those are unexpected assets, and that, you know, otherwise might have just gone ignored or not acknowledged, or maybe just not even been at the table if it weren't for applying these two frameworks in practice. And I'll share something from our Bear River region. You know, we'd been meeting as an LHCC for, you know, as long as LHCCs have been around. I'm new enough to our LHCC, probably it's been about 3 years since I've been involved. About a year ago, someone started attending LHCC meetings, and this was just before we started our strategic planning process. He was interested but kind of quiet at the meeting. I think we saw him at 2 meetings. By diving into a real community engaged process where we're, you know, taking stock of what are people's assets and strengths and what do they bring to the table. We learned that this individual is a former extension professor at USU. And very connected in the community, just started the Salvation Army kind of unit here in Cache Valley. And he and his partner have now, through the strategic planning process, they were very engaged through the process, but now are one of the chairs of our subcommittees at our Bear River LHCC, and are doing some really exciting kind of capacity building when it comes to communication, website, and other things that they have real technical skills and talent that they could add to the process, but without kind of that really intentional, I think, engagement throughout the planning process, that asset might not have been recognized.
That's awesome. And here in our community, and I think everywhere too, COVID-19 has presented a moment and an opportunity to potentially engage people that were on the fringes before and not actively involved in implementing change and moving the needle on homelessness. And I think COVID has really, in our community, brought to light that we are going to have some serious problems, and we need to start working together and collaborating and taking a holistic approach to the work that we're doing, so that as we move forward in this space, you know, whenever COVID is no longer an issue, but we're dealing with the aftermath of it, so that we can respond to those challenges appropriately.
Great. One thing that I wanted to just touch on, and you know, this is me wearing my university hat, and community engagement definitions kind of vary depending on what perspective you're coming from. But from a university perspective, one thing that we talk about a lot in community engagement is mutual benefit and reciprocity among partners. And so that kind of connects, I think, to what you're saying, Danielle, about that collaboration and building a stronger network of partners, whatever the size or, you know, scale of your homeless service system is in your community. You know, that driving force in community engagement is about a community centeredness and letting a community self-identify what the needs are.
So there are various principles for community engagement, and when we consider the community engagement process or the project design process or strategic planning process, there are some phases that we all generally go through as we work through these processes. And the first phase is really to develop relationships. We cannot, as a community, move forward and impact change if we don't have robust relationships in the community and understand where our assets are. Again, if we do not take an asset-based approach and really focus on developing those relationships and leveraging the resources we already have, we will not be able to enact sustainable change. And after that is a discover phase, you know, where we use the assets that we know of in the community and we allow those to inform what our actual needs are. We discover what the actual needs are in our community and how we can move forward. And that's when we get to the dreaming phase and the designing phase and delivering. And by using community engagement, we're really working towards self-determined change, sustainable change, because the change is community driven. Community members are involved, informed, consulted. And they're the most successful when we use community engagement as a process for planning and implementing change, and leveraging those partnerships and really considering power dynamics and how those work in the community, and leveraging those dynamics for our benefit, for that mutual benefit. Like Jess said, this is not a zero-sum game, and it can be considered from that lens fairly often, but there is mutual benefit to working together and solving these problems. And community engagement is also a human-centered design approach. You're considering the end user's perspective in all steps of the engagement and design process, so that your end result is actually applicable to those who are going to need that result.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say, Danielle, when we're talking about, pulling disparate partners together in a community, one thing that should be noted, and this varies a little bit depending on the size of the city or community that you're in, but oftentimes in human service kind of realm, certainly in nonprofit worlds, there can be a sense of competitiveness among agencies or entities. And that's a thing that really in a community engaged world has to be thrown out the window. And looking to more towards collaboration and partnering, that sort of can get in the way of that. And so I want to just acknowledge that that's kind of a stumbling block for a lot of communities, past what's happened in the past, or competitiveness around funding or what have you. Those sorts of things can get in the way, and ultimately what they get in the way of is what Danielle's mentioning here, that like the human-centeredness of it, and the client or the system kind of end user. That's where I think the impact really is greatest. I also want to make note of recognizing through the engagement process the power dynamics in your community. So one thing that I'll mention through our community engagement process in the Bear River region, we really undertook a pretty intentional power analysis. And you can think of people who have power and potential, and in this situation, power being the ability to kind of affect change, and potential being really the stakes are high for this individual or this group of individuals, in terms of the what happens in the system or how the change affects them. And in any work that we're doing in this community engaged kind of model towards improving homeless service systems, we have to keep in mind the people who have the least amount of power but the highest amount of potential. And it's important through that planning process where you're thinking about where to put energy and who to invest in and bring into a community engaged framework, because it can get really overwhelming, thinking about just like how many potential partnerships could be sort of undertaken. And so it's really, I think, smart to have some strategic kind of framework for how you're doing that. So I think, understanding who has power and who doesn't, and who has kind of the highest potential for being impacted by changes in the system, and bringing that, even if it's not really intentionally to the table, but in your mind, keeping that in your mind, I think is really important.
I agree. And what you said about competitiveness between not only communities, but individual providers within communities, because again, there's never enough money. And we face the challenge of individual organizations needing to keep their doors open and continue to serve people at the highest level possible, but also communities needing to progress together strategically so that we can impact change, sustainable change. And you're right, like we have to throw that competitive mindset out the window, especially given the additional responsibilities that are being placed on individual communities to strategize, identify gaps, prioritize funding. And we really have to, bring ourselves a level above and consider what community needs are outside of what individual organizational needs are.
All right, so I just want to talk a little bit about how you can integrate community engagement strategies in your strategic planning. So community engagement is going to work best when there's sort of this ongoing and cumulative process of both enabling relationships and building trust in the community. And that accumulation over time is part of the process that leads you towards success. So community engagement very clearly is not just a quick little model that you can apply and then, okay, that's done. It's an ongoing kind of iterative process that takes a lot of time and investment and a shared sense of vision in your community about what you're trying to achieve. So a couple of questions that I want to just walk through here. When we're talking about actually integrating community engaged strategies in a planning process, right? We really need to ask ourselves some questions about what is the purpose and scope of the community engagement. So will it, for example, be used to identify or prioritize what the needs and priorities are for strategic planning? Are we convening stakeholders and community members in a way to, like, for a kickoff for a planned change kind of effort to identify goals? Are we engaging the community to develop consensus around a proposal or a plan? So are we engaging community members kind of on the other side of the plan? Are we hoping to engage community members to inform decision-making or service delivery of a community or for a council or for a department? Are we engaging our community to develop new or collaborative ways of implementing the strategic plan itself? So sometimes a strategic plan will be adopted in a community and the work will be going fine, but for a million reasons, there are so many blockades that can get in our way, especially at this like major systems level change that needs to happen in our communities. There are so many wrenches that can be thrown into that system. And so I think at times, you might have a strategic plan that's 1 or 2 years old, but maybe you've lost some gusto in your community, and pulling community members back together and engaging community members around that strategic plan of, okay, can we think of maybe new implementation strategies for what are really good ideas still, right, in the community? Maybe your community engagement sort of purpose is actually to just review your progress on the plan. And this is a really important piece here. Oftentimes we just think of like the planning process, right? And how you've maybe engaged stakeholders and especially individuals with lived experience and other maybe unexpected partners through the planning process. But this last bullet point, I think, is a really helpful idea for folks who already have an existing strategic plan and are making progress on it. But who are you accountable to, right? As your LHCC, as your homeless service system, and not just accountable in who's mandating me to report, right? But who are you accountable to in the homeless service system in terms of making change that's really going to have a lasting impact in your community? And I would argue that engaging stakeholders at that stage, like well into the implementation of your plan, is a really important kind of hallmark of a robust community engaged approach.
So how do we apply these concepts of asset-based community development and using community engagement as a strategic process for strategizing in our individual LHCCs? Well, capacity building should always be strategic and focused. It is a fruitless effort to build capacity if it's not going to help you achieve whatever goals your community has. And we need to ask ourselves what our communities are working towards and what do we need to get there. And by having a clear goal in mind of where we need to go, we're able to focus our capacity building and be strategic And by maintaining an asset-based approach and having a full understanding of what already exists in the community, what we can leverage, then we have a better conception of what is actually needed in the community and what gaps really we need to fill. And we all know that the state wants individual LHCCs to have local strategic plans, and that can feel overwhelming and like a task that's tantamount to climbing Everest, or in the age of COVID, getting dressed and going to the grocery store. But we have to do it. And it can also feel especially overwhelming to consider how you make a local plan fit within the state strategic plan, because they should align. And fortunately, the state strategic plan on homelessness is rather broad. Yes, there are the specific goals to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring, but the strategies for getting there are not super prescriptive, and that is purposeful. It allows local communities to develop plans that are specific to what that community needs and to leverage assets in that community, and figure out whatever strategies that community needs to implement to reach those goals. And it might feel difficult depending on where your LHCC is in its development. There are some in the state that are really just getting off the ground, but it could feel like your LHCC doesn't even have enough structure yet, or to even try developing a plan. And so you can implement structural components for your LHCC to help guide your work, like bylaws, which can guide how your LHCC operates and establish continuity and consistency when there's leadership change, so that you don't lose that base of information and knowledge, and you're able to continue progressing whenever there's a change in leadership. And strategic plans as well are a structural component that, like Jess said earlier, sometimes they sit on the electronic shelf and they collect dust, but really they are a guide or a Bible, so to speak, for communities to follow as they move forward with their work and ensure that they're keeping on task and maintaining the direction in which the whole community has agreed it needs to go.
Yeah, Danielle, I want to mention just, I was reflecting before our presentation today of, maybe what's a takeaway that I would want folks who are in this session to have from what we're sharing today. And Danielle mentioned, the state's strategic plan and the need for, first of all, for there to be alignment, but also just that local communities and LHCCs right around the state are expected to be creating their own strategic plans that are really locally focused. And, it's part of, I think, some positive shifts that we've seen around funding allocation and other things, with a little bit more autonomy granted to LHCCs across the state of Utah. One thing that I think community engagement, it's a recipe for, and Danielle mentioned this earlier in principles of community engagement around relationship building. Community engagement principles and just like a framework and a sense of how you're going about this work are naturally going to result in stronger relationships and ties in an LHCC. And part of that relationship building is also centering around a common vision and, where you think the community needs to go, and not just where you think, but where the rest of the community is giving input about where you need to go as a homeless service system in your community. And the thought that kind of kept coming back to me in my reflection was, I hope to convey to all of you that that community engagement can be a really empowering process for LHCCs, and LHCCs can often feel, you know, like we all know, very strapped and overburdened, and there's a lot of feels like do this, do this, do this, and a kind of you know, that can be really a challenging place, and it relates back to this first perspective that we presented around needs versus assets, right? If you can help shift the kind of culture in an LHCC to think a little bit more intentionally about assets, to invest in relationship building, to help spread the workload and kind of share the load. If you're working towards a common vision, right? That's a little easier to do with your shared workload. I think the dynamic can change in an LHCC to one that responds to mandates, to one that feels empowered to make a change in their community. And like Danielle said, the state strategic plan is really quite broad. There's certainly some guidelines on what we're trying to achieve as a state, but there's really, I think, a lot of leeway to local communities about how to best, because we know our communities best, right, on how to best do that. So Danielle, go ahead to the next slide.
Oh, I just wanted to mention one thing too. When we shift our perspective from a needs approach to an asset approach, I think we're also shifting our perspective from developing things, which I would put like more in the needs approach and developing programs, to developing people, because people are the assets, and we're developing people to equipping them with the tools and knowledge that they need to actually help their communities and to be that driving force of change, as opposed to waiting for the government to do it, or, you know, the human services sector to do it. So when we're planning, in an ideal world, our plans look like the top image, and implementing those plans looks like the top image. They're linear, hiccup-free, no obstacles that get in our way. But unfortunately, that is not the reality. The reality for the planning and implementation process is really the lower photo. And the reality is that communities are not static, and dynamics and stakeholders evolve over time. Power structures change over time, and that can make the planning process incredibly frustrating. And it's important that we are always prepared to plan and replan and rinse and repeat. And it might feel like we're just spinning our wheels and we're not getting anywhere, and we're just spending all this time planning for plans that never really go anywhere. But it's important that we do engage in these processes, and that we have a good understanding of where our community needs to go. The caveat is just that we need to be prepared to pivot when needed, and that we are ready to continually check in with our communities about whether plans are still relevant and any changes are needed. And by keeping our communities engaged in these processes, it makes those pivots much easier and much more, they make us more adaptable and able to absorb those changes. And we need to continually allow our community assets to inform our planning and capacity building. Because again, if we really have a good understanding of assets in the community, then we'll have a much better conception of what our real true needs are. And community engagement really fosters self-determined change. Engaging our communities means that we are implementing community-driven change, which is sustainable change. So at this time, we'd like to invite questions from participants. And I believe you'll just use the raise hand function, and technical support staff will unmute you.
For those attending, if you would like to raise your hand, there is at the bottom of your screen a raise hand feature. And if you'll just select that. Looks like we do have one person, Tim Early, that would like to ask a question. Tim, I'm going to unmute you.
No.
There you go. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. On the last slide, I can't remember which of you fine people talked about the dynamic nature of our work, your work, our work. And you mentioned changes in power, I think, or change in direction. And I guess my question has to do with the idea of housing, that housing is the first option to drive. So housing first is the goal. And if that, I think that may have had a change as a primary focus, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And then maybe now it's back on top. Is that taken into consideration in developing the community engagement model? And I don't even know if I asked my question right, but maybe it's more of a comment.
Yeah, Tim, I love that question. I think I hear where you're coming from, and that question I think really centers on sort of like evidence and best practices in a larger field, right? In homeless services. And you know, the thing about a plan for a local community, I think, and I'm speaking of course from the Bear River region, you know, we can have best practices that are on the forefront of our mind as service providers and things that we're trying to achieve. Oftentimes our community stakeholders that we're pulling together, there has to be some sort of like also educational process for folks that you're engaging in the planning process, because we all come to this conversation around planning for homeless services with all sorts of different backgrounds and knowledge bases and so on. And so I guess my response, or at least the way that I'm interacting with your question right now, Tim, is around the importance of evidence still guiding the planning process, right? And what that looked like for us in the Bear River region was we had a consultant who came and did a couple of educational sessions with our full LHCC of what does an effective homeless service system look like? What are all the components? How should they, in a perfect world, kind of be operating? And that helped us move into more of like a gaps conversation and where we can put some energy. But I wonder, Danielle, if you have a different thought or response or direction you'd go with based on Tim's comment.
I would say that the state of Utah believes in housing first very strongly. However, in a state that is experiencing such an affordable housing crisis, it is difficult for that method and perspective to operate the way it should. And so here in the Weber Morgan LHCC, I mentioned earlier our affordable housing panel with the Weber Area Council of Governments. We got that up and running earlier this year, and so far all the work we've done has really been around that education and engagement aspect with community leaders in Weber County to cultivate a full understanding of how the affordable housing crisis is affecting people at all income levels, and how the consequences really trickle down and can lead to increases in homelessness in the community. So at least up here, yes, we are absolutely engaging our community around those conversations, and we believe strongly in housing first and focus on that. And housing is imperative for anyone, not just people experiencing homelessness. And we're working really hard to cultivate a full understanding and drive to try to solve the affordable housing crisis in our community.
I thank you for your comments. I guess I want to go back to the original, the first slide, not the first slide, but the first presenter, Dr. Kushel. And she said, we can do this. You know, we can do this. We can take care of people who have mental health issues and who have no housing. It just has to do with the overall strategy of what we're trying to do. And housing first, if a person is housed, then we can address those other issues. But if they're homeless and they remain homeless, it's harder for them to participate in any kind of a success program. So I again, probably more comment than question.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tim, and I totally agree. It's especially challenging. I'm not sure what LHCC or community you're representing or from. Especially that's a particular challenge in our LHCCs that have missing components in our homeless service system, and there are plenty of those around the state as well.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if, while others are thinking if they want to raise their hand or not, anticipate a question that maybe some of you have, and maybe it looks like this kind of reaction, like, oh, all right, this is a lot of like theoretical ideas around how to engage a community and why that's important, but what does it actually look like? Like, when you're actually like doing it. And I think that can look a lot different. There's a lot of ways that can look practically. One way that it looked in the Bear River region, was, in addition to our regular kinds of meetings and having different structure and prompts and conversation and kind of activities and things that we were doing, we were kind of intentionally thinking about who's not at the table, right? What other voices do we need here that haven't been here? And other types of just like relationship building. And so this is where, I'm a social worker and I'm a community social worker. And to me, a coffee date with somebody is worth a lot in terms of building a relationship and building some trust with somebody and inviting somebody maybe who was an unanticipated partner in the process to join the conversation and lend their talents and their assets to the issue at hand, right? So I just wanted to kind of make a plug for like what it can look like, what community engagement can look like sometimes really can just look like your average relationship building. And that's, when we're all really slammed, that's a really hard piece to fit into what you're doing. But I would argue and hope that, that you could advocate for those who are human service providers, those who are more administrative kind of level, of thinking about scheduling like relationship building into your week. It's a really important ingredient, I think, for this kind of work.
Awesome. And Jess, it looks like Allison has a question for you.
Great.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. Asset-based community development, I think, is great, and I've done some reading on it. And so I guess my question is, it is such a switch for many people from the way that things have always been done. And so as I've been trying to kind of cast the vision and explain, particularly like from McKnight's Abundant Community book related to that, the connectors table, it's sometimes hard for people to like kind of grasp that vision. So I guess as you've been doing this, what have been some ways like within the relationship building that you found is helpful to change kind of that mindset and help people see the benefits of this new way or different way of developing community?
Yeah, that's a great question, Allison. I have a couple of just initial thoughts. I think so. I think sometimes like an organizer in whatever kind of situation I'm in, but I'm thinking about like, what is the goal down the road? And then, and so that's sort of always like driving what my interactions are with people. And for me, the goal in the Bear River region is really to, for us to, as a Tri-County area, to get to a place where we feel empowered and able to make changes that have been like really a long time coming in our community, and for there to be buy-in and for there to be like broad support for these kinds of positive changes. And that buy-in and broad support, I don't think comes from a perspective of, look at all the ways that that either we're being wronged or, that the system is failing, or, there's those sorts of like that deficiency perspective. And so, it's something that I think that as you're doing this work, adopting yourself and like confronting when you drift into that area of like deficiency mindset is important, because what that looks like in conversation is, man, we have so many opportunities ahead of us. Look at these ways that, oh, in a perfect world, what would it look like, right? And dreaming and visioning in conversations to help move the kind of collective mindset more toward a goal instead of this sense of paralysis that oftentimes we have as communities around such a high stakes issue as homelessness, right? And so that's my first thought or reaction. Danielle, I don't know if you had other ideas there.
I do have some examples, not from my experience working in homelessness here in Weber County. I am fairly new to this position, just about a year on the job. But prior to that, I was serving in the Peace Corps in Ukraine. And just for some context, Ukraine has a notoriously weak civil society sector, and it's difficult to engage people with driving community change and being a part of that process. And I'll go back to what Jess said about developing relationships. Meeting people and planting seeds is a crucial component of the work we do. And when we drift into this needs-based mindset instead of asset-based, I think it's also important to remind ourselves that a lot of the work we do takes a lot of time, and many of us are not likely to see the fruits of our labors. It's, kind of a leap of faith that we're taking with the work we're doing. But with that in mind, it's possible to change minds. And that's what we are in the business of doing. We're in the business of changing minds. Allison, you mentioned that it is an incredible jump to go from needs-based to capacity-based. And it is about changing people's minds. It's about shifting their perspective. And we have to keep, banging on that door. And I think it really starts with ourselves and the way we conceptualize our communities and think about moving forward, and the rhetoric we use around our communities, and how we can develop solutions. I think the way we communicate to people in our community, I think it really starts with us.
Thank you very much for your input. And yes, you're right. Where there is, yeah, it can be hard to cast that vision when there's so many things right in front of us that we have to deal with. So yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
We do have about 5 minutes left, just a heads up.
All right, if there are no other questions, Danielle, maybe you could go to the slide that has our contact information.
It actually looks like Kelly Romer is raising her hand. If you all can unmute her.
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, I'm with Salt Lake County. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I just wondered, I work for Aging Services, and I've been involved with homeless services with seniors for about the last 3.5 years. And I'm just curious up in your county, what you're seeing in terms of your biggest challenges. I got involved when we were creating the new homeless resource centers down here. I went to some of those early planning meetings, and it was very eye-opening for me. The city mayor had community groups meet and did a lot of proactive work. And it was fascinating to be a part of that process. I'm curious what you're seeing as some of your biggest challenges and some of the hardest barriers that you feel like you're trying to overcome up in your county.
I'll just name a couple. I know that ours look very different in the Bear River area compared to the Weber County area. Although we're really intimately connected to each other for the reason that I've mentioned, our homeless service system missing some components, including emergency shelter outside of the domestic violence shelters in our area. So that's a real clear gap that we have in our community. And one of our biggest challenges are, I think, sort of stumbling blocks in the Bear River area. We're a micropolitan area of the state. So like I said, not quite rural and not quite metropolitan. And, homelessness looks different in Cache Valley and in Box Elder, Cache and Rich counties than it does along the Wasatch Front. It's definitely not there's not a visibility to it. And so what that means is for our community, there's a real opportunity for denial, that it's an issue in our community. And so that's one of our challenges is how do we invite folks into that conversation and educate and develop some sense of urgency in our community that some of those gap areas need to be addressed. Danielle, I know it looks a little different in Weber County.
Yeah, from my perspective, I would say that one of the biggest challenges we face is related to policy and some politics that are inhibiting our ability, even if we have a viable funding stream, to implement some programming. And right now, a solution to try to alleviate that pressure and obstacle really has been around that engagement and education piece with other leaders in the community from other cities, and to broaden the perspective so that issues around homelessness and affordable housing are no longer considered the issue of one community, but of all communities in our county, so that all stakeholders feel that they really do have a vested interest in solving these problems, and that it can't be solved by just one city within our county. You know, we all have a responsibility to implement change and to play a role in that change.
So looks like we have one last question, and then I think that'll be our time. So Michelle, you should be able to unmute and go ahead.
Thank you so much. I work for Ogden Housing here in Weber County, and I'm noticing a gap with services. I have to reach out so many times to other agencies to basically do my bidding for me because I don't have the resources that my client needs. And it's just not something that we've implemented. And you know how we try to not to double up on services. I'm still finding some little gaps there. So I'm interested in trying this concept, but I am fearful that, you know, the funding absolutely is not there. So I'm wondering if, you know, on volunteer basis and things like that, if I've got sponsors and things, you know, I'm worried now about what you were saying about establishing continuity and keeping the community engaged because I'm working with on a volunteer level. I can't commit to their commitment. You know what I mean? So I'm worried about that in the long run, whether I will start wheels spinning, provide a service, and then just pewter out because I can't keep it going. Any suggestions on how to maybe keep the community interested in helping me?
Yeah, Michelle. So it sounds like, you know, you're thinking about more from a framework of filling maybe a programmatic gap in the community.
Yes.
But it also sounds like, you know, you're really interested in being a part of the conversation and a solution kind of focused in Weber County. And so I would say, I don't know what your level of involvement is with the LHCC and other kinds of planning and organizing bodies in the county, but so much as your time allows, I'd really encourage you to get involved in those conversations, which I know are happening in Weber County, and, you know, be clear about what your, you know, your time constraints are and other kinds of, I guess, limitations to what you can participate or what you can offer, but bring your strengths. And it sounds like you have a lot of interest and enthusiasm around this issue. When I think the bigger question around like program sort of development is maybe something that we could, I know we're about to run out of time, but something we could chat about offline. But Danielle, maybe you have just a couple of last thoughts there to share.
Hey, Michelle.
Hey.
Let's, you and I get together, and I want to hear your thoughts, and I would love to help you through this process. And let's see, I mean, I want to hear your ideas, and let's figure out how we can leverage what our community already has and the connections that I have through working with the county, and see if we can fill some of these gaps that you perceive.
Beautiful, because you know, the gaps were smaller before and they were a lot less intense, but now with the COVID and the shutting down, the mental health clientele that I work with, it's just starting to build, and I don't foresee it with the holiday depressions coming up going to get any smaller. So I'm feeling like if I'm going to get something up and running by Christmas, then I got to start hustling now. So yeah, I would love to talk to you, Danielle. That would be great.
Okay, I'll coordinate a meeting. I'll send you an email.
Thank you.
Awesome, and that is our time, guys. Thank you, Jess and Danielle, for this presentation. I want to remind everyone we do not have a morning workshop tomorrow or a morning planning session tomorrow. We're going straight into workshops. So just make sure you check your agenda and get lots of caffeine in the morning. Come back ready to go.
Great.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you, Joseph and Pamela.
Thank you. This webinar will end in 5 seconds. Thanks again, ladies.